You know, people always talk about the, American dream, like it's this white picket fence and a manicured lawn where nothing ever goes wrong. But let me tell you, after 12 years as a Navy SEAL, my idea of a dream wasn't oppos. A magazine cover. It was just silence. I wanted a place where the only thing I had to fight was the weeds in my garden, a place where my girls could grow up without knowing what hard boundary, looked like unless it was the edge of our property line. But life has a funny way of reminding you that peace isn and oppos. Something you buy with a mortgage, it's something you have to defend, sometimes with your bare hands. It all started when we moved into Oak Creek Estates, a neighborhood that looked perfect on paper but had a rot underneath it called Margaret Vance, the kind of woman who treated a homeowners association like her own personal fiefdom and saw a child stray bicycle not as a sign of happy home, but as a personal insult to her authority. I remember that Friday afternoon like it's burned into my retinas. The sun was hitting the pavement just right, and my youngest, Lily, who's only 7 and has more heart than sense, was out on her pink bike, the one with the streamers that she insisted on keeping even though she's, grown up, Now, she was just circling the cul-de-sac, wearing that oversized helmet that always sits a little crooked, laughing at absolutely nothing. And I was on the porch, finally feeling like I could let my shoulders drop an inch or two. Then, out of nowhere, this black SUV with, neighborhood enforcement, plaster on the side pulls up, and out steps this guy, a guy who looked like he'd failed every police academy entrance exam in 3 states, but still wanted the power that came with a vest and a radio. He didn't talk, he didn't warn, he just walked straight up to my 7-year-old girl, and, with the kind of casual cruelty that makes your blood turn to ice, he reached out and slapped her across the face so hard her helmet rattled, all because her tire had grazed a patch of, common area, grass. This sound, man, that sound of a hand hitting a child's cheek, it's a sharp, wet crack that doesn't belong in a quiet suburb. It belongs in a nightmare. And for a second, the world just stopped. I saw Lily stumble back, her eyes going wide, her hands flying to her face, not even crying yet because she was too confused to understand that a grown man in a uniform had just hurt her, and in that split second, the Ethan Cross, who liked gardening died, and the man I spent a decade training to be took over. I didn't oppose. Think I didn't oppose. Weigh the legalities. I just moved. And if you've never seen a man move with intent, it's a scary thing because by the time that fake cop realized I was coming, I was already in his personal space. He started to reach for a mace canister or a radio, his mouth opening to probably bark some HOA regulation about, non-resident interference, But he never got the words out because my fist connected with his jaw with the weight of 12 years of deployments behind it. His head snapped back, teeth clacking together like dice in a cup, and he hit the side of his own SUV with a heavy thud that dented the metal, but I wasn't in oppos. Done, not by a long shot. I pinned him against that door, my forearm across his throat just enough so he could feel the reality of a situation, and I whispered, I didn't in oppos. Yell, because yelling is for people who aren't in oppos. Sure of themselves. I told him, you ever touch a child again, and they want in oppos. Fine enough of you to fill a shoe box, He was gasping, eyes darting around for Margaret, his queen, his boss, but she was standing 30 yards away on her pristine lawn, clutching her iPhone like a holy relic, screaming about, assault on an officer, violation of community standards, while her hired thug was turning a shade of purple that matched her prize-winning hydrangeas. You have to understand the build-up to this because it wasn't an oppos. Just one slap. It was months of Margaret Vance trying to break us, sending us fines because our trash cans were out 10 minutes past noon, or because the shade of blue on our curtains wasn't an oppos. On the, approved palette. She'd hired these, safety ambassadors, which is just a fancy word for bullies with nothing better to do, to patrol the streets and report on, visual clutter, and she'd specifically targeted my kids because she knew I wooed and oppos. Play her games. I'd seen her watching from behind her sheer curtains, taking notes, a woman who had so little control over her own life that she had to micromanage the length of her neighbor and oppos, as grass to feel alive, and I tried to be the, good neighbor, I really had. I'd gone to the meetings. I'd read the 200-page manifesto she called, in quote, bylaws, in quote, and I'd politely pointed out that her rules didn't and oppose. Override the Constitution, which only made her hate me more, because people like Margaret Dawn and oppose. Want order, they want worship. The police arrived about 6 minutes later, and Margaret was practically vibrating with excitement, thinking she was finally going to see the, in quote, troublemaker, in quote, in handcuffs, but she forgot one very important thing. I don't just train for combat. I train for contingencies. While she was busy screeching at the responding officers about how I'd, in quote, viciously attacked a law enforcement official, in quote, I just stood there with my arm around Lily, who was sobbing into my leg now, and I pointed at the 3 4K Nest cameras I'd installed the week we moved in, plus the dash cam in my truck that had a perfect wide-angle view of the entire street. When the real sergeant, a guy who actually knew what a badge meant, watched the footage of that, in quote, ambassador, in quote, leaning down to strike a little girl on a pink bike, the atmosphere in that cul-de-sac changed so fast you could feel the temperature drop. The, in quote, officer, in quote, on the ground, whose name turned out to be Gary, and who had a record for domestic battery that Margaret had conveniently overlooked during his, in quote, interview, in quote, was the one who left in handcuffs, not me. But the real satisfaction wasn't in oppos. Just seeing Gary hauled away. It was the look on Margaret's face when the sergeant turned to her and said, in quote, mind oppos. If you authorize this man to use physical force on minors, you're not looking at a fine, you're looking at a felony, end quote. She tried to backpedal, her voice hitting a frequency only dogs could hear, claiming she'd told them to be, in quote, firm but fair, end quote. But she'd made the mistake of sending those instructions via the community's official Slack channel. And let me tell you, the discovery process in a civil lawsuit is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It took a year of court dates and legal fees that would have bankrupted a lesser man. But we stripped that woman of everything, her position, her reputation, and eventually her house, because turns out when you use HOA funds to hire a private, in quote, militia, in quote, to slap children, the insurance company doesn't, in oppos. Just walk away, they run. We won a 7-figure settlement that basically ensured Lily's college was paid for 10 times over, and Margaret ended up in a tiny apartment on the other side of town where she probably complains about the noise of the hallway vacuum. But the real win was, and oppos, the money. It was the first time Lily got back on that bike after the trial. Her helmet's still crooked, and she rode right past Margaret's old house, now owned by a lovely family with 3 noisy dogs, and she didn't, in oppos, look over her shoulder once. I still think about that day, about the, in quote, what ifs, in quote, and I wonder if I went too far, or if I didn't, in oppos, go far enough, because in a world that's increasingly obsessed with, in quote, rules, in quote, and, in quote, compliance, in quote, we sometimes forget that the most important rule of all is that you protect those who can, in oppos, protect themselves. People in the comments are probably going to say I should have called the cops first. That violence is never the answer, but I'd ask you this. If it was your daughter, if it was your blood crying out because some guy with a fake badge thought he owned the sidewalk, would you wait for a dispatcher to take your statement, or would you make sure he never felt comfortable raising his hand again? I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again tomorrow, because some lessons shouldn't, in oppos, be taught in a classroom. They should be felt in the jaw. What about you? Did I cross a line, or is there no line when it comes to your kids? I want to know if you think the HOA system is fundamentally broken, or if we just keep letting the wrong people hold the clipboard. Drop a comment. Let's talk about it. Because I've got a feeling I'm not the only one who's had to deal with a Margaret Vance in their life.